Good evening. My name is David Johnson, and on behalf of the Icelandic National League of the United States, I'd like to welcome each of our valued members and guests to another presentation in our webinar series. 2 weeks ago, we hosted a webinar that maxed out our Zoom capacity. So if you missed that popular presentation about travel possibilities in 2021 to Iceland, given the evolving COVID restrictions and requirements, please visit our website at www.inlus.org. You can view tonight's webinar in a few days. You can view last week's webinar or any of the webinars that we've hosted so far on our website. We're here tonight to learn about fisheries issues in the Arctic. If you're anything like me, you love to eat the animals and plants that come from our oceans, but know very little about their habitats and lives underwater. In fact, the closest thing I've ever come to studying fish is with the snorkel and fins in Hawaii, and that's not very deep study. So now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Lauren Fields. Lauren was awarded a Fulbright scholarship that took her to Iceland, where she studied the topic of the Arctic fisheries. Currently, she works in the Washington, D.C. area for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. During the course of the presentation, we welcome any questions that you have using our Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. So ask them as you think about them, and we'll take them at the end. So now, please welcome Lauren.
Thank you, David. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation prepared. And David, can you confirm that you see my PowerPoint?
I do.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. In 2019, I was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to go to Iceland and research fisheries management and future fisheries management in the Arctic high seas. I did this on a sabbatical from NOAA, so the presentation I'm giving here is all research from while I was a private citizen, so the views aren't the position of NOAA at all. These are just my slides and my opinions. And my Fulbright was funded jointly by the Icelandic Fulbright Commission and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Iceland. And my talk today is going to be about fisheries management and the Arctic high seas. I'm going to start by introducing fishing technology and how we got to where we are today and what that means for fisheries expansion. I'm going to cover what it means to manage fisheries, including by recognizing borders and on land and by sea, and then how that relates to national jurisdiction in national waters, as well as international waters and management on those high seas spaces. And then finally, introduce what I worked on as a Fulbright scholar in Iceland. So I'm going to start with this picture of a boat that I took from the National Museum of Iceland. This is an early fishing vessel. This one particularly has a sail, but other early Icelandic fishing vessels were just oar-powered. And so I'm taking you all the way back. Icelandic fishing grounds are still incredibly productive. And the early settlers knew that these were very productive fishing grounds and exploited the ocean resources as a way to sustain their families and their communities. So these fishermen all went out just for day trips or maybe slightly longer, but again, they're limited by how much they could catch and how much they could bring back to shore, also without the catch spoiling. And I want to draw particular attention to how shallow this boat is. And these boats, think of the coastline of Iceland in many places is very rocky, pretty treacherous. And so having a shallow boat meant that you could avoid some of the rocky coastline and coming back to shore. And another very interesting thing about how people fished was that instead of storing the catch in the bottom of the boat, they would actually string a line through the fish themselves and drag them behind the boat. And this was a way to serve two purposes. It kept the fish cold in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, but it also then didn't weigh down the boat and then would make it easier to come back to shore. However, time goes on and boats get bigger. And so bigger boats can go out further. And this is a sail-powered boat in the distance here. And these boats may have smaller dinghies that go out and do fishing, such as this painting on the fog warning, where the vessel would go out and collect fish and put that fish in the smaller boat and bring that back to the larger boat. These larger boats then could have mechanisms on board to do the processing of the fish. In the early days, this was salting of the fish on board the vessel. And if you can preserve fish on the vessel, that means that you can stay out longer. Again, we're talking about time before ice storage or cold storage on board the vessels. As cold storage did evolve and fishing technology evolved, we have hand lining being replaced by trawlers. That's where a net is dragged behind a boat. And if you pick up a school of fish, you're getting a huge return on investment, right? You've got a huge amount of fish in one net dragged behind the vessel, and then that catch is brought up alongside. This is a side trawler, a British side trawler, and brought up into the vessel and stored in the hold of the vessel. Side trawlers were replaced by stern trawlers. And to give you a sense of scale, also in this time, we're also improving cold storage on board fishing vessels. So that means we're continuing to process fish on board a vessel in terms of filleting it, heading, gutting. And then we also have the means to store the catch on board the vessel in such a way that vessels can stay out longer and go further. So for scale, there's a person walking along a trawl, giving you a sense of scale on the size of some of these vessels and some of these trawl nets that are fishing out in the high seas. And so all of this is to say that now fishing vessels can freeze their catch. They can either store catch on ice in the hold of the vessel, or they can flash freeze the catch right as soon as it's caught and ensure that the consumer, when it gets back to land, is still getting high quality fish without, and the vessel can stay out longer without risking the quality of the catch. But I'm going to take a step back here and talk about that with borders. So you have fishing vessels now that can go out incredibly far and stay out for long periods of time. And this ties into, okay, whose waters are you fishing in? Borders are relatively a human construct. We have some national or geographical borders that cut through land that divide countries based on the geographical features, such as a river separating two countries or even two cities, and in a case of a mountain range cutting through and the peak of the mountain dividing two countries. Or you may have something a little bit more arbitrary, like just down the street from me, this plinth, a boundary stone saying the border of Washington, D.C. starts here. So all this to say, though, what do our borders mean to a fish? The answer is not much. Fish have to contend with their own borders, but they're very different from ours. For example, a fish might be constrained by depth, or obviously the coastline. They're not coming up on land anymore. They could be constrained by depth. So there might be areas of the ocean that are too shallow or too deep for that particular species. They're also constrained by temperature. And so many fish are what's termed stenothermal. They tolerate a very narrow temperature range, and they want to pick a temperature range that is optimal for them to live out their biological processes. And so if the water gets too warm or too cold, they're going to physically migrate to stay within their preferred temperature range. And we see this with changing ocean conditions, that this is already happening. And I'll talk a little bit about this later as well, where fish are migrating north in search of cooler waters, or migrating deeper, because often deeper ocean waters are cooler than shallower waters. So we do see fish migrating deeper or more north in response to changing ocean conditions. Another physical barrier for a fish, or a border, are ocean currents. And ocean currents can drive migration, picking larval fish up in a current that they can't swim against and depositing them elsewhere along the ocean. Or they can be constraining, such as the circumpolar current around the Antarctic, which actually acts as both a thermal and a physical barrier around the Antarctic continent. And the formation of this current actually led to the thermal isolation of the Antarctic and the glaciation of the Antarctic millions of years ago. So that ocean current spiraling around the continent led to cooler air temperatures and cooler water temperatures. And now you have species of fish found there that are found nowhere else in the world. And the current itself is strong enough that those fish can't actually swim across it. So you don't see migration of fish out of the Antarctic or into it from the Atlantic, Pacific, or Indian Oceans. So all this to say is the fish is going to go where the fish wants to go, and where it makes sense for the fish to go in terms of its temperature and depth and its life history. And so put that into perspective, think about the fisheries in the United States or elsewhere in the world. How we in the United States manage our fisheries affects how other nations in the world might be able to fish those fisheries if that's a fish stock that is found part of its life off the coast of another country. So for example, maybe the fish spawns in the US waters, and then migrates north to Canada, and then comes back to the US. Well, how we manage and fish the fish stocks would ultimately also have an effect on how Canada is able to manage and fish those same fish stocks. So cooperative management is very important here, and there is international law governing that you must govern or manage your fish stocks sustainably, so that what you're doing doesn't affect how your neighbor is able to also take advantage of that marine resource. So how important are marine borders to nations in terms of managing their fish stocks? First, I wanted to start with this statistic. So 78% of the world's oceans are covered by water, and of that, over 90% of those waters are managed in some way. And so that's national jurisdiction, territorial waters, or state waters off the coast of the US, or high seas management, which is that international management of fisheries. So again, how important is national management of waters? Well, literal wars have been fought over this. Excuse me, cat. And so I'm going to give an example of the cod wars in Iceland. In 1952, Iceland had a national waters extending out to 4 nautical miles. And but in the 1950s, the United Nations Council on the Law of the Sea was debating expanding the national water limit out to 12 nautical miles. And Iceland thought that was a great idea. Well, a lot of European countries were fishing in Iceland's waters because of the productive fishing grounds there. And so Iceland started exerting claim out to the 12 nautical mile limit. And the European countries, particularly Britain and Germany, did not recognize that 12 nautical mile border. So they continued to fish between 4 and 12 nautical miles. Iceland was successful in kicking the British out and extending its nautical mile or territorial sea out to 12 nautical miles. And then in 1972, the United States actually set a precedent by claiming oil rights out to 50 nautical miles following the continental shelf. So saying, okay, our continental shelf extends out further than 12 nautical miles, and we should have resource rights to our continental shelf. So Iceland again pushed the border out to 50 nautical miles, and Britain again did not recognize the claim of 50 nautical miles. And this is where things got interesting. Iceland developed these grappling hooks, which are called trawl cutters. The Coast Guard dragged these behind the vessel, and inside the joints of this grapple are actually sharpened blades. So the Coast Guard vessel would drag this hook behind the vessel, encounter a British trawl vessel, and this would snag on the lines of the trawl and cut the trawl itself. So, and once that trawl was cut, any catch and the net itself would sink to the bottom and be lost. The trawls are pretty expensive, especially at that time, and so a vessel likely didn't have a second trawl on board. So without a trawl, then that fishing vessel is forced to return home. So Iceland was successful then about pushing the nautical mile limit out to 50. And then in 1975, again, the Council on the Law of the Sea was debating expansion again based on continental shelf borders, and Iceland wanted to claim that 200 nautical mile limit as well. And so again, employed the trawl cutters and were successful at enforcing a 200 nautical mile boundary for their exclusive economic zone. So for comparison too, again, the scale of the map is obviously different, but the United States exclusive economic zone covers all 50 states. So the continental United States, huge exclusive economic zone around Alaska and Hawaii, but then we also have our territories like Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands and the islands out in the Pacific, Guam and American Samoa. And the US EEZ is actually one of the largest in the world at 3.4 million square miles. If we look at the exclusive economic zones of all countries in the world, you get this nice little bubble map. And this shows that anywhere that is this lighter blue color actually looks like an area that is not managed. And that's true, it's not managed by national jurisdiction. So everything within these bubbles is managed under the national jurisdiction of that country or coastal state. And these lighter blue areas are the high seas. But in fact, this is where that statistic about over 90% of the world's oceans being managed by a regional fishery management organization. And if we overlay a map of all of the regional fishery management organizations, you can see that there's very little of the world that's actually not managed in some way, the world's oceans. And so they're managed either by the type of fish themselves or the type of fishing, such as bottom fishing and the different ways that you're allowed to fish and the species that are caught in that way. And then even there's a number of organizations that just manage tuna and tuna-like or other highly migratory species. So if you look at, again, we've got the bubble map showing the exclusive economic zones and the blue areas where there's, in theory, no management, you can see that most of the world actually is now managed in some way, with the exception of this area right at the very tippy top here. And this is where my research at the University of Akureyri comes into play. So in 2019, I did a Fulbright scholarship at the University of Akureyri as a visiting professor. And I tried to put a picture of the university here, but the view from the university was just too beautiful, and all my pictures are looking out. So there is the bell of the university here, but I'm looking out across the fjord, and it's just an incredibly beautiful place. And while I was here too, I had a great opportunity to learn more about Icelandic fisheries, Icelandic fisheries management, and the marine resources that Iceland is managing. So I'll detour slightly to show one of the first things I got to do while I was there was go out with a professor on board a restored fishing vessel. And he did a summer class for students, grade school students, to take them out into the fjord and teach them about the marine resources in their own backyard in Iceland, a history of fishing in Iceland. And then once we'd motored out into the fjord, they got to try their hand at fishing. And so just with rod and reel, in about an hour, they filled an entire tub of cod. And these are good sized fish. So underscoring the importance of wanting to manage your resources so that you have access to your own stocks. And remember, I talked about temperature. So I love this cartoon, and I love including it in my talks. This is Tom Tolles, who was a Washington Post political cartoonist, and this is actually from 2013. And as I mentioned before, fish have their preferred temperature range, and it's been recognized that fish migrations are changing in response to warming water temperatures. So the cartoon says fish have been migrating to cooler water, so we just parked here and got the last of them. And to illustrate where they've parked, we've got Santa Claus as bycatch in the net, implying that they're sitting over the North Pole. So enter the Central Arctic Ocean Agreement. In 2018, 10 nations got together and signed a historic agreement to ban all unregulated commercial fishing activities in the Arctic Ocean until the science had been put into place for 16 years, or until conservation and management measures were developed to regulate it. So again, we've got the bubble map showing where the exclusive economic zones end, and this portion in the center here being the high seas. And this is important because this is the sea ice extent from 2000, so over 20 years ago. The sea ice maximum and is at the point at which the ocean temperatures are the coldest, the air temperatures are the coldest, and the ice has gone out to its maximum limit. And then later on, after that point, air temperature starts to get warmer, water warms up with the seasons, and the ice starts to shrink back. So the sea ice maximum in 2000 was occurred in March, and it extended out well into and past that Central Arctic Ocean area, all the way to the coasts of all the coastal states. The sea ice minimum for the year 2000 was, it occurred in September, so that's the point when the water, right before it starts to all cool down again, fall turning to winter, and the sea ice now starting to extend. So the sea ice minimum in 2000, we have occurred in September, and it still covers the entire Central Arctic Ocean. So that 200 nautical mile limit actually is extending out from here, and that whole area is covered by ice. But if we look 20 years later, and I apologize, I don't have 2020's data, but I have 2019. Again, sea ice maximum, instead of being March, now the sea ice maximum occurred in February. So the water starts to warm earlier. It's still extending out most of the way of the previous slide. But if you look at the minimum, now where that bubble map was, we're starting to see ice-free areas in that Central Arctic Ocean area, in that high seas portion of the Arctic, which means that it is possible that commercial fishing vessels and other vessels for that matter, can start to transit through the Arctic and may start exploring what the fishery resources look like in that area. So this agreement was signed in 2018 by the 10 nations to put a full stop on any potential activities while the science gets up to speed to understand how fish stocks are moving, how fish stocks may be entering that area, and what fish stocks are already there and what a changing Arctic might mean for them. So the objective of the agreement is to prevent unregulated fishing. So the emphasis is my own here to highlight important points. Prevent unregulated fishing in the high seas portion of the Central Arctic Ocean through the application of precautionary conservation and management measures as part of a long-term strategy to safeguard healthy marine ecosystems and ensure the conservation and sustainable use of fish stocks. So the conclusions that I made from my research and researching Arctic policy of all of the 10 signatories, as well as the changing fish stocks, migration, and looking at international fisheries management in other organizations, and this has been corroborated by others, that there's likely going to be the creation of either a new regional fishery management organization or some form of convention that may be put into place to regulate commercial fishing activities in this area. The agreement currently is only signed by those 10 nations. And so it may actually be opened to include other nations for future management. And an important point is that any future management of this region is going to have to balance resource use and conservation. And so what that means is there's likely going to be no appetite for all 10 countries to agree by consensus, meaning everyone has to say yes, that we should just put a marine protected area in there and not worry about it. Likely, there's going to have to be some balancing of protecting the region, conserving the ecosystem, but also managing the fish stocks themselves and allowing some sort of resource extraction. Excuse me. And finally, there's going to need to be protections for ecosystems and communities. The coastal states around the Central Arctic Ocean and the communities living and relying on those resources. This goes back to the Law of the Sea and the Fish Stocks Agreement, where how you manage your fish stocks can't affect how your neighbor is also able to fish those fish stocks. So any future management of this region and conservation of this region is also going to need to have protections in place for the ecosystems and the communities that rely on those ecosystems. So again, this was a very high-level overview of international fisheries management, and I wanted to just end with some pretty pictures of living in Iceland for the semester, including the aurora, getting to see that in the fall, and participating in sheep roundups in the north coast and in the West Fjords. And with that, and I want to thank the University of Akureyri, of course, for hosting me for this semester, and the Fulbright Iceland Committee for giving me this opportunity to pursue this area of research and learn more about Arctic fisheries management. And I hope you had a nice evening.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It was really, really interesting. I particularly liked how you talked about fish also having boundaries, just different kind of boundaries. I'd never thought of it that way. There is one question in the queue that's kind of personal for you, is like, how did you become interested in oceanography and this line of work?
I have always loved fish. We had a fish tank growing up, and I just really remember sitting and watching the fish for long periods of time. I got interested in fish biology through an interest in the Antarctic first, in Antarctic history and the early explorers. And so I devoured all the early explorer diaries and some Arctic explorers at that time as well. And there's the cat. And then in high school and college, got interested in fish biology, and knew that I wanted to do advanced study in fish biology, and particularly of cold fish. Really like cold fish. So I got my PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in Antarctic fish physiology to learn how fish can live in super cold water. And Antarctic and Arctic fish are employing a lot of the same techniques. And then saw this opportunity with the Icelandic Fulbright Commission and started researching the Arctic and Arctic fisheries management.
Wow. There's a question that's kind of focused on the species of animal. Does the agreement provide any protections to those species once they leave the area that's protected?
Right, so currently the area outside the agreement is national waters. So it's those species, any species that would be found in the Central Arctic Ocean, if they're also leaving that Central Arctic Ocean area, they would be within other countries' national jurisdiction. So you might have mackerel species, for example, or other pelagic or ground fish species, but that would fall under the national management of that country. And again, as I said, the fish is going to go where the fish wants to go, but then also how you manage your fish stocks cannot affect how your neighboring country is also able to fish those fish stocks, and vice versa.
Okay. A question's come in from somebody asking, what was the most surprising fact or thing that you learned about Arctic fish during your time in Iceland?
Ooh, fascinating. I think it has to do more with Icelandic fisheries, and it would be the quota system that Iceland has on their fisheries in terms of landing or bringing back all of the fish that is caught. So you have minimal fishery discards, which is where unmarketable or unprofitable fish are thrown overboard, and often they're dead. So that meant that when I went to the fish market, there were some interesting choices. And it was first interesting because all of the names are in Icelandic. So I would be that person at the fish counter being like, okay, what's that? Okay, what's that? And then they're trying to explain what a lingcod is. And I'm like, oh no, I know what a lingcod is. I just didn't know that was the Icelandic name for it. So, and then as part of that, then getting to try different species that you don't find in a US fish market.
Did you have a favorite, something unique that you tried there?
Wolffish, which I've seen while scuba diving before. They're really fascinating looking fish. So I would recommend Googling them. But yeah, seeing that in the fish market was unexpected, and it's quite tasty.
Okay. Another question, what do you think the biggest challenge facing international fishery management is today?
Great question. Most of these agreements, again, speaking for myself, most of these agreements operate by cooperation and consensus. And I think that is the hardest thing. I mean, global geopolitics play into that. Horse trading plays into that, and the overall arching objective of the organization may be the conservation and management of the stock, but that's an overarching objective. That's not a roadmap. So you have a number of countries that have to work together to figure out what that means and figure out how to reach a solution that's agreeable to everyone.
Okay. Somebody from Chicago, your home base of Champaign, Chicago, just north, I think. How much does fishing contribute to the Icelandic economy? And how does Iceland compare with other European countries in trying to protect its fishing grounds?
I knew someone was going to ask this, and I was going to look it up before, and I forgot. I can follow up with you after. It is a significant portion of the economy for Iceland, and more so than other countries' fisheries economies.
Tourism, I think, has probably eclipsed fishing in Iceland at this point.
Yeah, if it hasn't eclipsed it, then they're pretty close.
Okay. Is there a particular species of fish that is of most importance or interest to Iceland?
That would definitely be the cod. They have cod on their postage stamps, or at least they did, and a number of fish species on their money, their coins, and it is a huge part of the economy. You have other groundfish species, and some species are more marketable or more consumed domestically, and cod is one of those species that is of high value as a domestic export.
Of course, fish and chips has to be cod, right? How do you see a potential Arctic fishery management scheme incorporating indigenous management decisions and land water claims, such as the 6 indigenous permanent participants of the Arctic Council?
Great question. And the Central Arctic Ocean Agreement actually was written with specific language about inclusion of indigenous communities and voices as part of the process. So, as part of the establishing the science and the methods, but also the management going forward, including the voices of coastal communities such as indigenous communities.
Okay. Well, that wraps up all the questions that have come in. We just have 2 people that said, awesome talk, loved it. And thank you so much. We learned so much from what you had to say to us. Tack fyrir mig is what the person said. Well, thank you for this evening, and we appreciate your time and the really great information that you shared. And anybody that would like to become a member of INLUS to help support these kinds of activities, check us out on our webpage, inlus.org. Thanks very much, and good night, everybody.
And thank you guys for inviting me to talk today.